Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'm so pleased to have on Haviv Rettig Gur from Israel Today. He is the Times of Israel analyst that I listen to and watch the most. He comes and he goes. I think he's going to be gone next week, so I'm glad to catch up with him this week. Haviv, how are you?
Good, Hugh. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me on it's a very important day in the United States. There's a proceeding in New York about Mahmoud Khalil. It will go on for at least 3 more days. The United States is making the assertion that he represents a national security threat to the United States, and therefore his LPR status, he's a green card holder, does not protect him. Are you following the case? Does it interest you?
Yeah, I think it tells us something about the discussion that's happening in the United States on this issue. I take seriously the discussion in America about free speech and about government action and about, neo-Nazis marching through Skokie, Illinois was once a serious topic of discussion, and I respect it. But what worries me is that a lot of people, I mean, Senate Democrats in their official Twitter feeds are talking about this guy like he's some kind of hero and not like someone who distributes Hamas propaganda, not like someone who is the official representative to the administration at Columbia of an organization that talks about destroying the West and destroying my country. So it interests me because of what it represents in the American discussion more than
Well,
in
you just put your
anything else.
finger on it. People who are devoted to the destruction of the state of Israel, are in fact threats to American national security because America has no more important strategic ally than in Israel. It is the most innovative, the most courageous. It's a nuclear power, whether or not they talk about it, and it's in the most dangerous region in the world, and they are our ally. So if you threaten the existence of the state of Israel, you're a national security threat in the United States. I don't expect you to know the U.S. Code, Haviv, but 8 U.S.C. 1227 provides the Secretary of State with absolute authority to deport LPRs when they become a national security threat. That's my whole argument. We'll see if it holds up. I think the Supreme Court will. I've been teaching common law for 27 years. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn, but I think it's a good argument.
I'm afraid on this issue, I'm the Holiday Inn guy.
Ha!
I'm a little frustrated. I do think Israel is America's best ally. Incidentally, irrespective almost of America's actions, Israelis know that America is the source of the democracy in the world today and the freedom in the world today. Israelis want to live in an American-led world and not in any other world. That's something we're not confused about in the way a lot of Europeans who are more dependent on America are confused about. But why would senators tweet not this is a serious civil rights question, free speech question, but tweet free Mahmoud Khalil as if he's some kind of Nelson Mandela. He's not a Nelson Mandela. He's a radical who literally belongs to a group that openly talks about destroying the West. It's
Yeah,
you're making the connection between Israel and America, but this guy made it himself. You don't need to make it for him. He's the one who
and
says he
so
wants to be
I
protected.
hope that this gets to SCOTUS in a hurry, but I want to go back to the ally. I originally called you up to set this up before Khalil was arrested or detained. He wasn't actually arrested because Donald Trump is back, and there are two important things. He understands China is the only superpower adversary the United States has, and he understands that Israel is our ally. And in fact, I began to think about this listening to commentary podcast. Donald Trump is the most pro-Israel president since at least Richard Nixon during the Yom Kippur War, and maybe since Harry Truman. Do Israelis get that?
Donald Trump wins Israelis by a huge landslide. Israelis don't necessarily understand and follow the day to day, don't know American culture wars and all of that stuff. They live in their own world, in their own language, etc. But they get that Trump is suspicious of Iran in a way that the last administration, even when it supported us in all kinds of really important tactical ways, but grand strategically kept letting Iran off the hook, kept, loosening sanctions, kept, letting sanctions be skirted in massive multi-billion dollar ways. This administration looks like it's much more serious about calling Iran to task, calling our existential threats to task.
Again, you've
I think
anticipated
Israel
where
is
I'm
going to know
going. For 45 months, Israel has a friend in the White House. After that, we have no idea who's going to be in the White House. It could be AOC. It could be one of these Senate Judiciary Democrats who are free Khalil. It could be an active, open, hostile opponent to Israel. Do you think everyone in positions of authority understands the next 45 months is the window to deal with Iran's nuclear program, or it could close forever?
I'll say more than that. Israel has been extraordinarily successful in the last 5 months or so in revealing the weakness of the Iranian empire, in forcing the entire Middle East and the Iranian regime itself to watch as 120 Israeli planes overfly Iran, and Iran can do nothing about it. It turns out that dictators, other than blustering and posturing, are actually weak. Iran is this extraordinarily talented country. Its one weakness is that regime, and that regime has weakened the country. And so we actually can fight Iran and we can defeat Iran. But that very weakness that now the whole world knows about has meant that Iran is now seriously considering breaking out to the nuke. So we're entering a period in which we are in some ways safer. The Iranian empire now doesn't dare to do what it dared to do 17 months ago. But at the same time, it's more dangerous because it's much more likely that Iran is going to seriously now break out to a bomb, and this thing has to be taken care of. There's a window of danger, really, to prevent the Middle East from going nuclear.
I agree with that. I agree with every word of that. I'm just wondering if it is widely understood. It is not widely understood in the United States that, in fact, the collapse of the circle of fire that Khomeini built for 40 years at extraordinary cost, the collapse of that has put Iran in the position of North Korea, which is we'd better get some nukes or we're going to be vulnerable to South Korea. Does the whole country get that Iran's on that brink right now?
Every Israeli knows that. Every Saudi knows that. Every Iranian knows that. You're asking me if Washington knows that. I'll tell you real simple. When President Obama came into office, Israeli reporters talked to American officials, and we said, "All right, well, you're a new administration. You're Democratic. What are you? Who are you? What is your policy in the Middle East?" And the first answer we got was, "We're not Bush." And that was the policy, not being Bush. And then when Trump was elected, we got a similar kind of attitude from the Trump administration. We're not Obama, which in that case was music to Israelis' ears. But still, the point was that it was about domestic politics intruding on foreign policy. And now that Trump is back, he's not Biden. And so there is a sense in Washington that I don't know if they know that so much as everything is domestic politicking. I don't think the Senate Judiciary Democrats have any idea who Mahmoud Khalil is. I think they just think this is the anti-Trump thing to tweet. And that's true of the Iran policy writ large. So officials tell us that American officials at the highest levels that they're talking to know this. Will that translate in Washington into the kinds of steps that are necessary and the kind of understanding that we need Washington to have? I just don't know.
I think that might be a little too hopeful, Haviv. I listen to commentary every morning, and Matt Continetti and John Podhoretz were talking about the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. When you toured the U.S. 2 years ago, I think you got protested at Harvard, and you kind of chuckled. It's gotten much worse. Are you aware of it? It's just much, much worse in 2 years.
Yeah, but I still chuckle. I'll tell you a funny story. We had data about American Jewish college students. Most of them were not interested in Jewish groups on campus.
Hold on. The music means I got to take a break. We'll come back and get the story from Haviv after the break. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt with Haviv Rettig Gur from Israel, where he's senior analyst for Times of Israel, and I listen to What Matters Now whenever he sits down with Amanda Dan to talk about big issues in Israel, and I try and get him on at least every month to 6 weeks to catch us up. Haviv, when we went to break, you were telling me you're still chuckling about anti-Semitism and protesters in the United States, when I'm getting more and more concerned, as are all supporters of Israel in America, because it's spreading. Tell me the story that you began.
Well, first of all, I think it's the duty of Jews to chuckle in the face of anti-Semitism. We certainly don't have to live in the anti-Semites' gaze in fear and seeking absolution from their claims of our innate criminality. That's not something Jews have to do. But also, we have data from pre-October 7 campuses where we know that American Jewish college kids were just like all other college kids and mostly stayed away from Jewish organizations on campus, whether it's secular ones or religious ones. And about 15% took part in Jewish life on campus. And since October 7, that's shot up to 40%. And so, how shall I put this? Thank you, anti-Semites. The Jews are finding their way back to their community. We owe you a bouquet of flowers.
Well, that may be happening, but at the same time, on both the right and the left in America, I mean, there are many examples. I'm not going to go down and name them. There's a rising tide of disguised, thinly disguised anti-Israel / anti-Semitic populism that's made its way into the podcasting world that appears to, in various disguises, but it's the ancient evil. Are you? I guess you're not surprised by that, but I am because I'm 69 and it has been methodically crushed for my lifetime, and now it's back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean by saying that Jews coming back is a good thing, therefore, and we don't have to be worried about anti Semitism. Anti Semitism is back in a big way. You have historians now talking about how Hitler wasn't the bad guy in World War
Right.
II. You have, Candace Owens talking about the Jews always only looking out for their own. I don't think there's a single American community that has looked out for everybody else statistically more in terms of their voting patterns and advocacy and activism in the history of America. You have all of this discourse and all this rhetoric, and the crazy part of it, Joe Rogan platforming Ian Carroll to talk about how the Jews, Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad honeypot operation for American elites and all these other things. Last week, the single biggest media event in America were these string of anti-Semitic people platformed on the by far the largest Theo Von and Joe Rogan and others on the largest podcast in America. I mean, tens of millions of people listen to that stuff. There's
And they're not
nothing else
particularly,
that anyone in America.
I like those guys. They're not particularly well read. And the audiences that they attract are 18 to 30-year-old young men who may not have gotten the greatest education in the world. So it's kind of a very fallow field in which to sow seeds of hate.
I'm glad you said that because Joe Rogan has also interviewed a lot of Jews and a lot of people who do speak for Israel and say and tell our story, our history. Never mind, the talking points and the sort of propaganda wars, actually told about us. But all at once, all in a concentrated blitz, you have these voices about how Jews are evil and Jews are conspiratorial and Jews are plotting the failure of America, and it is reaching many, many millions. It is mainstream. It is just one of the voices now in mainstream American debates. And as a colleague of mine wrote more beautifully than I could, October 7 put Jewish blood in the water, and now the sharks are circling. And that is happening at the top
Oh.
of American media, and we're seeing it.
Well, what's interesting about American media, by the way, I don't know Joe Rogan. I've never heard other than a clip of his show because he's a comedian, and I don't think there's a lot for me to learn there. And he's a good interviewer, but it's not a serious show, and I've never heard Theo Von. I don't know if it's a serious show. Has Joe Rogan invited you, Haviv, as perhaps the most articulate, young, next generation commentator from Israel, sort of the Michael Oren of the next generation? Has he invited you to come and spend 3 hours doing your just breakdown of basic Zionist history?
Not yet.
Would you do it if he said, come on over here? I mean, I'll help raise the money for the ticket.
I would not turn him down.
All right, that's good. Don't go anywhere. I want to come back to you and ask you about just a couple of quick developments in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria, because we got 9 minutes left, and we can cover all that in 9 minutes because it's Haviv Rettig Gur. Once again, Times of Israel. They've shut down for some reason their daily podcast, but at least I get once a week Haviv Rettig Gur with Amanda Dan, and I recommend to you What Matters Now at the Times of Israel podcasting page. Stay tuned. Haviv will be right back. Welcome back, America. 9 more minutes with Haviv Rettig Gur, my friend of broadcasting only. I've never met him. I hope to someday. He writes for Times of Israel. You can listen to him over at Times of Israel. You can follow him on X at Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, at the Times of Israel today, there's so many headlines. One, new talks with Lebanon aimed at normalizing ties. That's Israel. Nobody's expelling any Palestinians, Trump says. We've got new outposts on the top of Mount Hermon, which you've never had before. And you've got the Druze in Syria coming to work in Israel, and a deal between the Druze and the Kurds and the Israelis. Is this a massive realignment that we're just not paying any attention to it because Trump is here and Trump's better ratings?
It is and it isn't. The Middle East is basically divided into four major alliances. You have the conservative Sunnis, all the kingdoms, the Saudis, Emiratis, Jordanians, Egyptians, Moroccans. Everywhere you look in the Syrian civil war, the Libyan civil war, they all work together, always, everywhere. You have the radical Sunnis, the Muslim Brothers, Hamas, Qatar, Turkey. Everywhere in the Middle East, they support the same militias in the Syrian civil war. They work together. You have the Shia, that's the third alliance, who all the Iran's proxies, all the different Shia in Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq all work together. And then you have a fourth axis. And these are the four axes that define the Middle East. They have more truth to them. They're more important to understanding the Middle East than the actual nation state borders of the Middle East. And those are, let's call it other, that fourth axis. It's the Jews, it's non Arab Muslims, it's non Muslim Arabs. If you go to northern Iraq and talk to Kurds today, you will meet a tremendous number, statistically huge number, of pro Israel Kurds in northern Iraq. And if you go to the Druze, you will meet pro-Israel people in Syria. And if in 2015, when Jabhat al-Nusra, commanded by the man who is today the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, commanded by a man who is today the president of Syria, was coming down the Golan Plateau and threatening the Druze villages of southern Syria, the Druze of southern Syria literally called their Druze brethren in Israel, who went to the Israeli government and asked the Israeli to protect the Assad loyalist Druze community in Syria. And the Israelis did so. And Jabhat al-Nusra never touched those Druze villages. And so you have an alliance of Kurds, of Druze, of Jews, of some others throughout the Middle East that has been reflected throughout the Middle East. Iran has targeted northern Iraqi Druze with missile strikes, claiming they're Mossad activists. That's not impossible. No one in the Middle East said that's impossible. So the Israeli, what you're seeing is not a new alliance. What you're seeing is now that Syria has collapsed in on itself, everyone's trying to pick up the pieces in ways that are favorable to them. The Israelis are now making a bid to actually protect their allies, prevent a Islamist radical, a man who once swore allegiance to Al-Qaeda number 2, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is now running Syria. And Turkey is his patron. And to prevent that from becoming an Al-Qaeda state, it has to be weakened. And so Turkey is moving in from the north. Israel is moving in to protect the Kurds and the Druze as much as it is able. Everybody's trying to maneuver. And you're seeing that right now.
Haviv, 25 years ago, after 9/11, I had to get smart in a hurry about Islamism. And I used Bernard Lewis because he would come on the show and he'd talk forever, the late Bernard Lewis. And he left embedded deeply in me strong horse, weak horse theory about the Middle East. A, do you believe that's true? And if so, who's the strong horse right now?
I don't. So Bernard Lewis was truly a giant. Even if you think he's wrong, his scholarship was tremendous. He went deep into the weeds before coming out with theories. And today people start with theories and then ignore the weeds.
You're
and
right.
Basically just quote line their way through history. And that's too common in academia, certainly in academics who speak publicly. Most academics are too scared to. But those who do generally are activists more than academics. So Bernard Lewis was a giant. I think that on these questions, I take a different tack. In other words, I think that the Middle East is a bunch of people telling themselves stories about themselves, like all people everywhere, and living out those stories and responding to those stories. And so we face enemies who think that there's a great war now to restore Islam, which is very weak in the last few centuries under Ottoman rule in the Middle East. And Islamic weakness is to them a tremendous theological problem because Islam, of course, should be a great redemptive conquering power. So they want to restore Islam at all costs. And they use these very old ideas in Islam about how geopolitical power is a function of piety rather than a function of, let's say, good economic policy, to develop these pietistic jihadi movements. That's the basic idea behind Al-Qaeda. The more pietistic we are, the more just literally pious, the more we're similar to the first generations of Islam, the more we will be powerful and Islam will awaken and return to conquering the world. So we do face those people living in those stories. Hamas believes that fundamentally, and Mr. al-Julani in Syria believes that.
Well, we can't do anything about them. All we can do is, actually, all I can do is talk to Americans primarily. What do you want Americans to understand about the strategic relationship, this fourth axis and the United States? Because I think the United States ought to be with the fourth axis and with the conservative Sunnis in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, bringing those two axes together and making it very clear that Israel is a strategic ally in the global competition with China. Because that's our number one priority is China. and Israel's our best ally. I always say the equal of any ally. I don't want to make anyone mad, but they are at least the equal of any ally that we have. What would you like to hear American elected leaders say other than don't say free Khalil?
I'll tell you, look, Hamas is a fascinating organization because it is a Sunni radical organization from that axis, supported by Qatar and Turkey, but it's embedded in the Shia proxy system of Iran. It marks
Right.
an alliance between those two radical axes. And the response to that developing and burgeoning alliance over the past few decades has been what has essentially become, in the first Trump administration, the Abraham Accords, which is the conservative Sunnis and, again, we'll call them other, those two axes forming a counter alliance. So they're now in the Middle East, basically, the way the Middle Easterners think of it. The reason the Saudis are eager for the Israelis to defeat Hamas, the reason the Emiratis classify pro Hamas activist groups in America as terror groups in their law, even if America doesn't classify them terror groups. The Emiratis hate Hamas more than America hates Hamas. And the reason for that is that they understand the Middle East in these terms. And so if America understood the Middle East in these terms, it would have a much smarter policy. It would understand the place better. It would understand where Libya is going and Syria is going and Iraq is going and who the forces are and what they think they're doing. And if America did understand that, it would understand that one of those two alliances is utterly pro America and will remain so.
Great clarity, as always. Haviv Rettig Gur, thank you for spending a half hour with me. Good travels to you. I'll catch up with you on the other side, and I hope if you go on Rogan, it'll be the first time I listen to Rogan, and boy, do we need that. Thank you so much, Haviv Rettig Gur. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Don't go anywhere.